It's become trendy, at least in my social media feed, to say that boredom is good, that it's an essential part of a healthy childhood, that mere boredom alone, is all children need in order to have deep and meaningful learning experiences. When an article or a friend says boredom's good, it's usually more about soothing parental guilt. It's more about the parents rather than what's good for the children. Often in these articles, there are legitimate points that we can agree with heartily. One, that passive entertainment isn't good for children. Yes, we agree with that. That perhaps kids should have a lot of unstructured time to play. Yes, we agree with that. That we shouldn't be scared of the crisis that might happen when we turn off the TV or take a device away. We certainly agree with that. And that we shouldn't necessarily interpret our children's discomfort as a sign that we've done something wrong as a parent. Boredom can be the necessary place that we all have to stop in on our way to somewhere much more pleasant. But if we get stuck there, or if we visit too often, it's actually not good for us. Boredom is not the destination. Boredom doesn't bring creativity to life. Too long spent there, or getting stranded there and not knowing how to get out, is actually harmful to all people, including children. Our role is not merely to say no to things, to deprive children of something that isn't helpful for them, but to lead our children into all that's good. In a world where boredom is endemic, we're scared of free time. We've been trained to have fickle, narrow, fleeting interests. Charlotte Mason's method gives us a new way of being, both for ourselves and our children. She gives us a way to escape the tyranny of boredom, to shake off the terror of empty hours. In Philosophy of Education, Miss Mason says, "The person who can live upon his own intellectual resources and never know a dull hour, though anxious and sad hours will come, is indeed enviable in these days of intellectual inanition, when we depend upon spectacular entertainments in order to pass the time." We are in cultures that are sick with boredom. We distract ourselves from the fact that we're bored. We carry spectacular entertainments around in our pocket to help us pass the burden of time. Props which only tighten the shackles which stop us from escaping the tyranny of boredom. We are overpowered. We are mastered by boredom. If we turn off the distractions and face the fact that we are bored, it's uncomfortable, but it's a healthy step, a necessary step in learning to master it, in learning to overpower the boredom, which otherwise overpowers us. So we need to work out what boredom is and where it comes from, and then we'll have a better idea how we can take charge of it, and then how we can help our children to take charge of it also. Psychologists have made many attempts to make sense of boredom. Some say that it's a search for neural stimulation, that it's an emotion, a personality trait, a chemical imbalance. But we don't need an expert to tell us that it is not a pleasant experience. Some say it's a symptom of depression, and others say that chronic boredom actually causes depression and anxiety. Using Charlotte Mason's categories, perhaps we could say that boredom is the absence of an idea, not having an interesting thought or thing to occupy one's attention. It can be a symptom of a malnourished mind, a mind not living and growing the way it was designed to. Miss Mason says, "But mind does not live and grow upon entertainment. It requires its solid meals." Chronic boredom is a sign of starvation, an inanition, a decline, a withering of our personality. Miss Mason says people fall prey to all kinds of ailments and vices simply because their minds are not receiving the nourishment which is due to them. Boredom is far from being a good thing. Boredom might also be a lack of desire. Perhaps there are things and ideas before us, but they're not what we want to do in that moment. Miss Mason also talks about the pride which leads to boredom, thinking that we're above, too good for the things and the ideas and the people who are in front of us. That what we have within reach is beneath our interest. That the thing worthy of us is somewhere else. Boredom is discontentment. I remember a couple of years ago when Liz said, boredom is ingratitude. Like C.S. Lewis writes in Perelandra, the second of the Space Trilogy books, when our heart goes after the thing we wanted, the thing we expected, then the thing that's actually in front of us, the good that's in front of us, tastes insipid. If boredom is a lack of neural stimulation, a lack of excitement, Miss Mason has comments about that as well. In Ourselves, she says, we call this sort of intoxication excitement, and it is no harm as an occasional thing, but persons may come to want excitement every day, every hour, and may mope and be dull without it. They want excitement for the same reason that the drunkard wants drink, and for the same reason too, the more they have, the more they want. I do not say he must never be excited, for whatever pleases or troubles us much excites us. But that is quite a different thing from going after excitement, from being uneasy if something exciting is not happening all the time. Boredom can be a listlessness, a restlessness, which feels time weigh heavily on our hands, causing us to merely pass the time instead of taking hold of it masterfully. Boredom can be a form of pessimism. We won't try a new book or a new activity because we don't expect it's going to be very interesting anyway. It's a disinclination to do what could otherwise be enjoyable. While boredom is mostly an attitude problem, it can come out of an activity problem. We're interested in pursuing an idea. Maybe you want to weave a tablecloth, but we lack the skill or the resources to do it. Now, as adults, we have our own agency. We can access the resources and the help and the materials we need if that's something we want to do. Our children are dependent on us to give them the resources they need to try and take charge of their own boredom. When we don't give in to the inefficiency and sometimes inconvenience of helping them, then we hinder their own attempt at mastering their own boredom. A boredom which would otherwise overpower them. Boredom and our passive entertainment-based solutions to boredom are the great undoers of our time. Boredom is robbing us of our sanity and of our joy, of our ability to relate with others, of our very personhood. I wonder how much better statistics about mental health would be if everyone of all ages, all walks of life, were getting their proper nourishment, their meals of the mind. Boredom is not good. It is overpowering us and making slaves of us. It is one of the quiet, constant threats embedded in our lives, which ruins from the inside out. While making parents feel better, the boredom is good movement can actually be a bit unkind to children. They suggest that all you need is nothing to do and your child will suddenly become creative. This is simply not true. Children need a well-furnished store of ideas and skills and relations to tap into if they are going to have the resources to be able to deal with boredom. And whose job is it to put them in the way of these relations? The parents. If we merely switch off the power in the house and then do nothing else to build an alternative, lively environment, if we're not providing a steady diet of ideas, if we're not helping children grow into the habits which strengthen their will, if we give the gift of free time but then have not done anything else to educate our children up to the power of enjoying it, then we're doing our children and ourselves a disservice. It's a bit like dumping a child in outback Australia and then just telling them to find their way home. Some of them might, but most of them won't. Or it's like expecting a 3-year-old will suddenly be able to cook themselves a nutritious and delicious meal if we just leave them to get hungry enough. That the need somehow produces the provision. Well, learning to travel in a hostile place, learning to feed oneself, and learning to use empty time all require some sort of preparation. Learning how to get out of boredom is a skill which we as parents either help or hinder. In ourselves, Miss Mason says we all have need to be trained to see and to have our eyes opened before we can take in the joy that is meant for us in this beautiful life. And then in formation of character, she says, it is a duty to put this power of getting enjoyment into the hands of the young. It is one of our great duties as parents, not merely to let our children get bored, but to give them the power to deal with it. Training them up to the power of enjoyment, helping them to learn to see. We have gifts far greater than boredom to give our children. When I first started homeschooling, long before I met Charlotte Mason, I relied heavily on boredom as my method of education. In all honesty, I was just really tired having babies and I was a bit lazy. I was also extremely bored myself, and that probably had a lot to do with chronic depression and anxiety, a whole package of things. My policy was to schedule nothing, to have a whole lot of unstructured, open-ended time. I set up an art studio, we had a lot of books, and the kids had time to do as they pleased. As long as they weren't on a screen, I was happy with whatever they chose to do. I believed boredom was all my children needed in that resource-rich environment in order to be occupied and satisfied and have meaningful learning experiences. But having all freedom, ample resources and surplus time became a boredom both for them and for me. Boredom alone is no magical catalyst for creativity, for spontaneous learning. My children didn't know how to use their gift of time because I misunderstood where creativity comes from, where ideas come from. Creativity doesn't spring out of a vacuum. Ideas don't come suddenly into an empty mind. Our home had some atmosphere, but we were missing the discipline of habit and we were missing living ideas. We were missing the feast, so boredom was familiar. Being bored then becomes a habit. We hear Miss Mason's wisdom about the habit of boredom. She says, "Now, no one can employ leisure fitly whose mind is not brought into active play every day. All classes must be educated and sit down to these things of the mind as they do to their daily bread. History must afford its pageants, science its wonders, literature its intimacies, philosophy its speculations, religion its assurances to every man, and his education must have prepared him for wanderings in these realms of gold." Our minds, our children's minds, need to be fed and prepared to enjoy their leisure. It takes time to learn how to overpower boredom. In Formation of Character, Miss Mason says, "But we may not check these growing pains by any means which stunt our growth. And to begin with the children, we may do something to keep them from getting into the habit of being bored." She explains that boredom is often the result of not paying attention. Miss Mason goes on to talk about how short lessons in the morning help combat this habit of inattention, this habit of which then leads to boredom. The children would not be bored. They would discover the delightfulness of knowledge, and we should all benefit. For we might hope that instead of shutting up our books when we leave school or college, each of us under 90, say, would have his days varied and the springs of life renewed by periods of definite study. We should all be students, the working man as well as the man of leisure. In Charlotte Mason's method, the mornings provide the steady, full schedule of short lessons, a pageant of living ideas coming before the child. A great variety of subjects are covered in the morning. The morning schedule spares us and our children from the effort of decision. We're carried along the well-worn path of habit, taking us through those hours. The morning schedule has a gentle formative effect. training the habit of attention, training the intellect, and training the character. And there's just not time to get bored. Seeds of living ideas are sown in the morning lessons. While our monotonous lessons would lead to boredom and restive behaviour, many varied, attentive living lessons are invigorating. This is the wealth our children draw on when they face boredom themselves. But our afternoons need to be different from our mornings. The mornings would lose their power if we continued at the same pace all day into the evening. Miss Mason was adamant that morning lessons should not drag on beyond the appointed times, that afternoons should be free for a different pace. Our intense mornings are so rich with knowledge that they become root-bound if they're not given the spacious afternoons. If the afternoons were a continuation of the morning lessons, we'd all be worn out and suffering from intellectual indigestion. Mornings are for encountering living ideas straight from the minds of others. Afternoons are for taking hold of these ideas and expanding them. It's a time where thought begets thought. It's open space where a relationship which began in a morning lesson has room to expand and develop. Clear afternoons don't just give us a break from the mornings, they add value to our mornings. It's a time where the tree can set fruit. And our afternoons need the rich intensity of our mornings. Empty mornings will lead to bored afternoons. Boredom looks inward at unmet desires. And Miss Mason's hope for children was that they would be taken outside of themselves. Our challenge is to help children get away from thought of themselves. And she says, there are many ways of getting away from the thought of ourselves. The love and knowledge of birds and flowers, of clouds and stones, of all that nature has to show us. Pictures, books, people, anything outside of us will help us escape from the tyrant who attacks our hearts. This wonderful self-forgetfulness happens when they are absorbed also in a craft of some kind, when all their attention, their eye, all their muscles, all their senses are fixed on mastering a material. Whether that be leather, yarn, fabrics, fibre, their own bodies, charcoal, pastels, inks, a loom, food. The movements and tools and skills introduced as part of our morning lessons in handicrafts or in drill fostered dozens of potential ideas which the child can then develop in their afternoons. This expands their scope to be interested. Every thought, every object they meet in a morning lesson is a seed which could become a prolific field of growth in the spacious afternoon hours. After my boring start in home education, fast forward 10 years, and the art materials, the books, the outdoor spaces get better use. Although the designated art studio has long gone, my children have now been better prepared to make use of the materials and their time. The difference is a full table of morning lessons. They're no longer left to their own mental dawdling and the sluggish habit that I was accidentally training them in. They're no longer left subject, prey to the boredom which attends that sluggish dawdling habit. They are still in the process of strengthening their powers over boredom, but boredom is now an occasional pit stop rather than the place where we get stranded. So we're to have wide, expansive, rather free afternoons, but the freedom of the afternoons is not absolute. While Miss Mason doesn't prescribe for afternoons the way she does for morning lessons, she still points out elements which ought to fit in somewhere. The afternoon is when a great many hours outdoors are meant to take place. Hours outdoors in nature where we can't help but see beyond ourselves when we look at the great vista from a high mountain or notice the small intricate details and are reminded of God's love and genius, his cleverness on display in every atom of creation. Outdoors, children are led into the enchanted grounds of self-forgetfulness. The free reading of poetry from the terms poet, some drawing, notebooks, literary reading, Checking reporting on current events, sometimes Shakespeare reading, are all meant to be done in the afternoons and evenings, not as homework, but just as part of their routine and the family culture. The afternoons are when the household and neighbourly responsibilities are meant to happen, where there are opportunities for chores, service, volunteering. Afternoons are to be under the self-government of the child, but they're not to be for self-focus. Part of our problem with boredom in society these days is the assumption that in order to be happy, we should be free to do as we please, that we owe no one anything, that duties are a depletion of our joy. The duties which punctuate our afternoons are actually a gift to our children, to remind them that the most satisfying joy doesn't come when we get to curate everything the way we want, so it's just right, only doing our favourite things. But that satisfying joy sneaks up on us when we're not expecting it, when we're just getting on with doing the next good thing. Instead of looking for the most exciting option, well-managed afternoons give our kids experience at reframing their expectations of life. We can help them consider something worthwhile instead of being slaves to excitement. We can encourage them and equip them to do something good. Then their time isn't about feeling a certain way, of alleviating their own discontentment, but about achieving something which can bless someone else. The more absorbed they become in a wide range of interests, the less sway their feelings will have. We're setting them up for long-term joy and stability. Our children are more likely to experience the reality that our emotional needs are met not when we're spending all our time trying to feel a certain way, but when our existence is not oriented around our feelings. Isn't it remarkable that something as simple as how we use our afternoon hours is so closely tied to spiritual formation, our maturing personhood? We truly are integrated whole beings. What we do with time forms who we become. In ourselves, Miss Mason says, if we would keep in soberness, we must work, read, think. More, we must be thankful. There is no person's life which would not be exceedingly interesting if he lived it fully. And he whose life is full of interests does not seek excitement from drink or other sources. When they are satisfied and well occupied, the need for illicit pleasures, the need for conflict even, diminishes. The battle against boredom, the fight for good afternoons, is ultimately a spiritual battle for the personality of our children. Well, some practicalities. Part of the joy of living fully comes from work. By bringing our kids into our household work, although it seems far from fun, we're actually strengthening their power over boredom, their power to take interest and even find pleasure in things which don't seem to promise much. If you are primarily attending to lessons in the morning, unless you have a paid staff to do the work of your household for you, like the cooking and cleaning and the yard work and the laundry, then you are going to have a lot of work to do in the afternoons. And your kids are also going to be participating in some of that work as part of their afternoon occupations. And if you're keeping your mornings mostly for lessons and you're actively involved in the lessons, there are other things like errands and appointments and visitors that will also have to fit into the afternoons. So it can be very hard to be managing the bulk of all our responsibilities and still be keeping the afternoons free for the children learning to manage their own interests. So, how do we get all the work done in a way that doesn't dislodge our afternoon occupations? We need to budget for the responsibilities we actually have and use part of the afternoons to help our children understand and participate in those responsibilities. Miss Mason said that young people should understand and know how to perform every duty of a household, even if they're in a situation where they wouldn't end up doing most of that work themselves as adults. Learning to do the work of home is part of fitting our children out for future joy as persons in an era. By them growing in competence, they actually become more efficient, the work becomes less of a big deal, and they have more free time and more skills available with which to take charge of their time and all their responsibilities. We're actually setting them up for more joy when we bring them into work. About 5 years ago, when I was sick on the couch for months at a time with morning sickness, my brilliant husband started the annual roster. And we're still doing it now, 5 years later. Each child has one particular chore they are trusted with for an entire year. So when it's time to unpack the dishwasher, I know to call Ewan. And when the dishwasher needs packing up, then it's Oliver's turn. When there's dishes in the sink that need washing, dishes that can't go in the dishwasher, then we call Calvin. Audrey is responsible for doing all the washing and hanging the laundry out on the line. And I have to say that we actually do hang our washing out in the line to dry in Australia. We only use the electric dryer when the weather is terrible, like raining for weeks on end. Just in case that thought was distracting you. And then my eldest son, Winton, scrubs the bathrooms and toilets. My husband and I then fold the washing and everyone helps to put it away. Now, of course, there's, other work that gets done and people are just expected to help cheerfully when they're asked to do something, and we all need to tidy up our own messes and take responsibility for our own bedrooms, things like that. But the jobs that need to happen multiple times a day are covered in this simple system. I don't lose hours drawing up a roster. There are no disputes over whose turn it is to do a job. And the kids have a whole year to learn how to do their particular chore really well. At the end of the year, they get promoted to the job next up in difficulty. We've also had extended seasons where the 3 oldest kids will cook 1 meal a week each. And by the time you use the leftovers, that means there are no afternoons in those weeks where I'm actually cooking. I mention these things because they're part of our afternoon occupations, but they also cover the everyday work that would otherwise be done by me. And so my time is more available to help the younger children who are still learning how to take charge of boredom. It also means that there's a bit more space for the non-routine jobs to get done. Instead of seeing errands and chores as an intrusion into our afternoon hours, our afternoon occupations, we can reframe them as opportunities to prepare our children to take charge of their space, of learning to be interested and cheerful, even in the most mundane tasks. Learning to enjoy ordinary work as well as free time is a process. Our children are educated up to this power of enjoyment. It takes time, so don't feel like you're failing or your kids are failing if they come to you with a droopy face and an expression of boredom. We're in the middle of a process. It would be far nicer to be at the mature end of that process, but we're all at this conference because we're still in the middle of it. So don't be surprised when your children are bored and they need to learn how not to be. Perhaps the long, empty afternoons are a bit much for your kids if they aren't quite sure what to do with all that time. Perhaps they're overwhelmed by the blankness and having too many options, or by the perfectionist tendencies and desire just to have it be the best afternoon they could possibly have instead of something just good. While they're getting the hang of choosing for themselves, it might be helpful to put some landmarks in. Some families find it helpful just to have a routine of taking a short walk after lunch every day. There's no effort of decision, it's just a given, this is what we do as a family, and that is enough to refresh everyone's senses and get the kids doing something totally different and outside. We're not to tightly schedule the afternoon time, but if the kids are restless, if they're a little bit fidgety, then perhaps you can give them a 20-minute focus. I'm setting the timer for 20 minutes while you guys go out in the backyard and build an obstacle course for your baby brother. You're helping them pass the effort of decision. You're giving them an open-ended task which takes them outside of themselves, thinking about the needs of someone else. You've filled in some minutes, as in they've got to actually build it, and then there's the time spent playing with it, which may end up being 3 hours if they kind of get into the groove of it, and then the time spent packing it up. You also have a blessed baby brother. The focus can be enough to recalibrate everyone's mood. Or you could create a delightful destination. Set out a lovely afternoon tea, make it a beautiful table to be at, and then just invite everyone to bring their free reading and say everyone is going to sit here for 20 or 30 minutes, just read your book quietly. You'll disrupt their discontentment for a while. If it's a worthy book, you never know what idea will come to them in the time of that reading, and then keep them occupied for the rest of the afternoon. You'll also be setting a family culture. Who doesn't want to sit around sipping tea and nibbling something lovely for afternoon tea with your children while we all read quietly? Maybe if you've got an afternoon and people aren't sure what to do with themselves, you can set a family mission. Kids, Mrs. Huxley next door is so tired while Mr. Huxley's in hospital. So you can ask for volunteers to bake some cookies. You can get someone to help you make a meal. You can recruit someone to go and pick some flowers from the garden and someone else to write a card. Then you can all walk over next door and deliver the meal to bless a neighbour. The goal of the occasional leadership you show in the afternoons is that you can then reseed. These afternoons are meant to be the time where masterly inactivity really comes to the fore. The art of wise letting alone. By putting effort into building an atmosphere, by making sure the children are nourished in their morning lessons, and by putting effort into noticing and counterbalancing, mitigating the hindrances that are coming up, then you gain a broad free space for the children and also for yourself. The solution to boredom isn't the bustle of a mother who is orchestrating everything that's going to happen for everyone's entertainment. The solution to boredom is a mother who makes sure that the children are prepared, that they're nourished and strengthened to learn how to resolve boredom themselves. When boredom is a reluctance to do anything at all, then it's a decision-making problem. And perhaps that's where your training needs to start. Helping them over that hurdle so they can remember what it's like to enjoy something that they didn't feel like doing and that they mightn't have chosen themselves. Eventually, though, you want them to be able to set their own agenda for their free hours, apart from the times when you have responsibilities that they are going to be occupied with instead. Perhaps helping children to not get stuck in boredom feels inefficient for a while. If we say yes as much as we reasonably can to their interests and be available to help them, then there'll be other things we don't get done. We need to be ready to set our knitting aside to help them with theirs. And haven't you noticed how as soon as you do sit down to do a creative project, they want to come and all of a sudden learn how to sew or knit or weave or do some of their brush drawing as well. We need to be okay with not exploring all our own interests for this season while they are learning to explore theirs. Actually, it's a really good outcome if we are interrupted and they are captivated by a new idea. Take time to apprentice them into your interests and into the household work, even though you find it much easier to do that work without their help. We're aiming for more than just happily occupied children. We're training them to take charge of themselves, to take charge of everything that falls within their reach in life, to not be a slave to how they feel, but to be interested and grateful in God's world. As we come to an end, it's worth mentioning that the skill of overcoming boredom needs to be protected and preserved, and it often needs to be relearned when conditions change. As the children grow into teenage years, there are so many more variables. Their interests are growing, their relationships, their responsibilities are expanding, and they can often forget the skills they used to have about dealing with their own boredom, and they need to relearn them all over again. So don't lose heart, but be prepared to have to help them rediscover how to be interested, how to be grateful, how to take pleasure in ordinary things in life. In Formation of Character, Miss Mason says, "The taste for parties of pleasure, for what may be called organised amusements, is an ever-growing taste, and dislodges the habit of taking pleasure in the evening reading, the fireside games with the children, the home music, the chat with friendly neighbours, the thousands of delights the home should afford. Pure and true pleasure is of impromptu occurrence, a stray gift, found, not sought." The power of taking pleasure can be dislodged by our excessive extracurricular activities, by our intense social calendars, by the ever-present infinite entertainment available on our screens. At the heart of boredom is a void, something missing. An idea, an interest, optimism, gratitude, intellectual nourishment, skills, materials, energy, time. But boredom itself doesn't provide what's lacking. Rather, the feast we spread for our children gives them the nourishment and strengthens their wills to be able to overpower boredom. The afternoons are the training ground for them learning to exercise these powers. By training our children into the power of enjoying what's good, the slower but richer, truer, more beautiful things in our homes, we put them in the way of that stray gift. The gift of joy found, not sought. Joy for a lifetime. We're helping them become people who are more inclined, more interested, and more able to notice and take pleasure for their own sakes, for the sake of blessing others, and ultimately for God's glory in His world.